Under a sky where the stars bled their last light into the abyss, the Cadian Gate lay silent. The great bastions, those ancient sentinels of stone, steel, and faith, stood like weathered statues, their once proud banners torn into threads by the breath of the void. Beyond them, the eye of terror churned like an ocean without shore, its colours sickly and shifting, its depths a promise of damnation. This was the last quiet before the storm, a moment so fragile it seemed a single breath could shatter it. We speak of this night because it is the eve of endings, and endings are worth remembering. We speak of it because, though the galaxy would burn, though walls and worlds would fall, there was a beauty to the stillness before fire came. And we speak of it because, even as the void closed its jaws, there were those who stood defiant, not for victory, but for the right to die standing. And before we begin, know this: we truly love and care for you, wherever you are in this moment. Before we cross into the storm together, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, take your coffee in hand, breathe deep, and step with us into the night before the end. Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughan stood on the command balcony of Casa Myrick's highest bastion, his silhouette framed against the spectral glow of the Cadian Gate. The wind from the high walls carried the tang of promethium smoke and the faint metallic taste of the fortress's power fields. Below, the regimented streets wound like veins through the casa, each one lit in pale bands by lumen lamps that flickered under the strain of failing generators. His eyes, scarred and darkened by decades of siege light, scanned the horizon. There was no movement in the night, only the jagged outlines of defense towers and the shimmering veil of void shields. Yet Vaughan knew the enemy was already here, in a sense. Not in flesh and steel, but in whispers, in omens, in the way the soldiers flinched at shadows that hadn't yet moved. He had been a soldier of Cadia all his life, and a commander for most of it. He had defended this gate through 13 sieges, 9 Black Crusades, and more incursions than he could count. He had buried comrades, rivals, and his own blood beneath the stones of the casas. The weight of memory was heavier than any armour he had worn. It was not fear that gnawed at him now, but something quieter, a hollowing knowledge. Cadia had always held, always, but no fortress, however sacred, could hold forever. Not when the enemy beyond the gate was eternal, patient, and unbound by the limits of mortal will. The Imperium's Vox broadcasts still proclaimed the gate unbreakable, but Vaughan had seen the truth in the flicker of the Astronomican's light. The heart of the Imperium itself was faltering. A chime echoed in the chamber behind him, soft and deliberate. Lord Castellan, a voice called, measured, careful. Captain Thaline stepped into the balcony, light, her armour plates catching the pale glow. She was younger, though only by a decade or two, with the posture of one raised in the casa drills since birth. Report, Vaughan said, his voice a low rumble. The outer watch posts at Casa Parthex confirm increased warp activity along the belt. The astropaths refuse to speak of what they've seen. Vaughan's gaze stayed fixed on the gate. They've been refusing for days. Sir, there is also a matter with the orbital supply trains. Several have failed to arrive. The Navy claims mechanical fault. Mechanical fault, Vaughan repeated, the words heavy with disbelief. In the middle of reinforcement season. They stood in silence for a moment. Thaline shifted her weight, then added more softly, some of the men ask whether the Imperium will send more aid if this is another crusade. If, Vaughan said, and there was no conviction in it. He turned to face her fully, studying her with the steady gaze that had cowed enemy officers and drilled recruits alike. They will send what they can, and we will hold with what we have, as we always have. Thaleen nodded, but he could see the doubt in her eyes. Doubt was a seed, and in Cadia's history, seeds could grow into fractures faster than walls could be rebuilt. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint vibration from deep within the casa. Vaughn felt it in his boots before he heard it. The bass hum of the shield generators cycling harder. He knew what that meant. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the void had stirred. He dismissed Thaleen with a nod and stepped back into the bastion's inner hall. It was a vast chamber lined with memorial plinths, each carved with the names of the dead from centuries of siege. The lumen lights cast long shadows between the stone pillars, shadows that seemed to move a little too slowly. As if reluctant to follow the light, his thoughts wandered, unbidden, to the last message from his son. It had been months ago, short, curt, the words formal to the point of cruelty. Father, trust no envoy, trust no counsel without proof. The Imperium does not speak with one voice. That was all. No signature, no plea, nothing of the boy Vaughn had raised. The Inquisition had its own ways of shaping men. At the far end of the hall, an aide approached with a data slate. My lord, the night patrols report a disturbance north of Casa Calorn. Vox relays failed for 42 seconds. When they reconnected, the patrol sergeant claimed to have heard chanting. No enemy sighted. Vaughn took the slate, scanning the brief. Mark the sector for escalation. Increase watch rotations. The aide hesitated. Sir, the men are already on double shifts. Vaughn's expression hardened. Then they will hold the line tired, or they will be relieved permanently. When the aide left, the Castellan paused at one of the memorial plinths. He traced the engraved name of an old comrade, feeling the cold bite of the stone under his fingertips. It would not be long before more names were carved, perhaps his own. He made his way toward the Strategium, the high command chamber of Casa Myrak. From here, the entire Cadian Gate's defense network could be monitored. A web of orbital bastions, minefields, fortress moons, and picket fleets. Hollow projections showed the warp front like a living wound, expanding and contracting as if it breathed. Tonight, it seemed to swell. A sudden spike flared on the readings, bright, jagged, unnatural. Vaughn's hands clenched behind his back. He had seen such patterns before. They marked the opening moves of something vast, something coordinated, not a raid, not a probing attack, a crusade. He let the breath out slowly, forcing the tension from his shoulders. There was no room for fear. Fear was for soldiers who could afford to hesitate. Commanders carried the weight differently. He would keep the mask in place until the very end. Outside the wind rose, rattling the banners that still clung stubbornly to the bastion walls. The stars above the gate dimmed, as though a shadow passed over them. And in the depths of the eye, something turned its gaze toward Cadia and smiled. The night before the storm had begun. The dawn over Casa Myrak was a pale, reluctant thing. The light came not from the rising sun. Cadia's sun was little more than a faint ember in the sky, but from the fortress city's own lumen arrays, casting cold illumination across the drill yards and parade grounds. From above, the casa looked like a vast circuit of discipline. Rows of barracks, armory spires, and gun emplacements, all drawn with the precision of a lifetime soldier's mind. Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughn stood at the northern wall, watching the morning drills unfold below. It was a ritual as old as Cadia's defiance. Recruits in the grey-green of the Cadian shock troops marching in lockstep, laser guns at the shoulder, sergeants' voices cutting the air like whips. To the casual eye, they looked flawless. To Vaughan's, the flaws stood out like cracks in ice. The 4th platoon lagged a fraction in their turns. The 12th's weapons discipline had slipped. A handful of men's eyes were not on their drill sergeants, but on the shadowed western horizon, where the Cadian Gate loomed like a wound in the heavens. Even here, in the disciplined heart of the fortress world, fear had begun to take root. A quiet tread approached from behind, steady and unhurried. Commissar Dara joined him at the parapet, her black greatcoat brushing the stone, the silver aquila on her cap catching the cold light. She was lean, with the hard-edged posture of someone who had never once let her guard down. Not in thought, not in sleep. "Discipline is holding," she said without looking at him. Her voice was like the edge of a blade, precise, unyielding. "Barely," Vaughan replied. She let the silence stretch for a moment before continuing. "Fear weakens men faster than hunger, faster than fatigue. When they look at the gate, they see death waiting. You must keep them from seeing it." "I'm not in the habit of blinding my soldiers to the truth," Vaughan said, his tone measured. "You're not in the habit of losing them to despair either," Dara countered, her gaze still fixed on the drills. "If you want them to fight, you give them certainty. Certainty that they'll live, or certainty that dying will matter." Vaughan said nothing. He had heard her creed before. Dara believed in the Imperium's great truths, the kind written in blood and scripture. Vaughan had spent too long on these walls to believe in absolutes. A klaxon sounded from the lower yard, marking the change of drill phase. Recruits broke into fire teams cycling through target practice on the moving ranges. Vaughan turned from the wall and began the long walk to the fortress armory, Dara falling into step beside him. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of oil and ozone. Rows of laser guns, hotshot packs, and power cells were stacked in perfect order, the quartermasters moving like clockwork through their routines. Vaughan paused to examine the inspection logs on a nearby console. Supply shortages were becoming harder to disguise, particularly in ammunition stocks. "Another shipment delayed," he murmured. "The Navy claims the warp lanes are unstable," said a voice from behind. Captain Thaleen strode into the chamber, her grey armour scuffed from morning exercises. She saluted crisply before adding, "3 supply trains have been rerouted to the Helican subsector. Apparently, their need is greater." Dara's lip curled. "Greater than the gate? That's treachery dressed as logistics." Thaleen glanced at her, then back to Vaughan. "If the shortages continue, we'll have to cut live fire training. We can't risk burning through what we have before the enemy arrives." Vaughan closed the inspection slate. "Cut nothing. Cadia does not win battles by training with empty rifles. We fight as we drill, and we drill as we fight." Thaleen inclined her head, but her expression remained tense. They moved together into the strategium, a circular chamber dominated by a vast hollow table. Maps of the gate and its surrounding defense network hovered in the air. Static lines of fortress moons, orbital bastions, and void minefields. It was an impressive array, but to Vaughan it felt smaller each year, as if the gate itself was swelling to dwarf the defences around it. Reports scrolled across the table's edge in pale text. Sightings of warp surges along the outer belt, intermittent astropathic interference, fleet maneuvers that made no tactical sense. One entry drew Vaughan's attention. "Casa Calorn, signal loss, 38 seconds. He tapped the report open. That makes 3 in as many nights. Thelene frowned. Sabotage. Perhaps. Or the warp bleeding into comms channels. Dara crossed her arms. Or someone ensuring certain orders never arrive. The weight in her words hung between them. Vaughn didn't answer. There had been whispers among the officers for months now. Rumours that some Imperial commanders were less than committed to Cadia's defence. In most places, such thoughts would be heresy. In Cadia, they were dangerous truths. A junior Vox officer entered, saluted sharply, and handed Vaughn a sealed data slate. Priority transmission from Segmentum Command, sir. Vaughn broke the seal, his eyes scanning the message. The lines were short, clipped and cold. Strategic adjustments underway. Cadia to hold with existing forces until further directive. Reinforcement schedule suspended. He set the slate down slowly. What does it say? Thelene asked. That we are to hold, Vaughn replied. His voice was steady, but the words landed in the room like the tolling of a funeral bell. Dara's expression was unreadable. Then we hold. Thelene's jaw tightened. With what? The same fleets and regiments we've had for years, against whatever's coming through that gate? Vaughn met her gaze. Yes, with what we have. The Imperium has given its order. And if the Imperium has decided we're a pawn to be sacrificed, she pressed. Dara's hand drifted toward the bolt pistol at her hip. Careful, Captain. Vaughn raised a hand before the tension could break into violence. Enough. We will not tear ourselves apart before the enemy even fires a shot. The strategium fell silent, except for the low hum of the holoprojectors. When the meeting broke, Vaughn returned alone to the balcony overlooking the gate. The sky was darkening again, clouds drifting low over the bastions. Somewhere out there, beyond the minefields and void stations, an enemy was gathering. He could feel it, not in the way a soldier senses an ambush, but in the marrow, in the slow tightening of fate's hand. Cadia had always held. But as he watched the storm clouds roll in, he wondered, for the first time in his long career, if this was the battle that would finally break her. The council chamber of Casramirak was carved from adamantium-laced stone, a vaulted hall where echoes clung to the walls like ghosts. Here, beneath the soaring arches, the leaders of Cadia convened, the Castellan, his captains, the commissariat, and representatives from the Imperial Navy. Their faces were carved from years of war, worn, wary, and burdened by secrets heavier than armor. Vaughn entered with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who had long since learned how to carry the weight of impossible choices. The room fell into a brittle silence as he took his place at the head of the council table, a vast disk of black ceramite etched with the sigils of ancient wars. Hollow projections hovered above, flickering with the grim statistics of attrition. Fortress worlds lost, supply lines severed, void stations silent. The situation beyond the gate deteriorates, Vaughn began, voice low but firm. Reports from the outer defences show increasing warp storms, and enemy incursions grow bolder with each passing cycle. But worse still, our reinforcements dwindle. The Navy claims logistics failures, but I hear whispers of something else. Captain Arik Doss, a stern man from the Segmentum Solar Fleet, shifted uneasily in his chair. Lord Castellan, the Imperial Navy's priorities must balance the many fronts. Helican's subsector's demands are urgent and immediate. Our supply convoys to Cadia are not abandoned lightly. Vaughn fixed Doss with a gaze cold enough to cut steel. Then perhaps the Imperial High Command has found Cadia expendable. If so, I would have that truth spoken openly, rather than whispered like poison in the halls. From across the table, Commissar Dera's voice pierced the murmurs. Expendable or not, Cadia's duty remains. We hold the gate, or we die trying. Loyalty to the Emperor is not measured by convenience. A murmur of agreement followed, but Vaughan saw the shadow behind the words. The cracks in the facade of unity were growing. Captain Thalin, seated beside Vaughan, leaned forward. I've spoken with some of the younger officers. There is a growing belief that our sacrifices serve little purpose, that the Imperium has already decided we will fall to buy time for other worlds. Vaughan nodded slowly, a grim expression shadowing his features. Doubt is a seed. If nurtured, it becomes betrayal. Then we must weed the garden, Dara said sharply. Root out those whose loyalty falters. The room tensed. Vaughan raised a hand to quell the rising tempers. There is no time for purges. The enemy gathers, and internal conflict will only hasten our ruin. A transmission blinked to life on the hollow table, displaying a grainy image of a fortress moon consumed by fire and shadow. Casa Valus has fallen, the message announced, without resistance. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Vaughan's heart tightened. Casa Valus was the first line of defense beyond the gate, its loss a blow that could not be overstated. How? He demanded. A force of chaos cultists and warpspawn overwhelmed the defenders before the reinforcements arrived, Doss replied. Their fleets were delayed. Vaughan clenched his fists. The picture was becoming clear. Cadia was being starved, left to bleed. Later, in a private corridor, Vaughan found Captain Thalin, leaning against a pillar, her face shadowed. They're abandoning us, she whispered. At best, they watch from afar. At worst, some among them welcome our fall. Vaughan's jaw tightened. Then we hold, not for terror, but for Cadia, for the men who trust us with their lives. She met his eyes, fierce and tired. And if trust isn't enough? He hesitated. Then we become something else. Above, the stars beyond the gate flickered like dying candles, as if the galaxy itself mourned the coming storm. The skies above Casa Parthex churned with unnatural fury, the horizon warped by roiling clouds that shimmered with the sickly hues of the warp. Pale green, bruised violet, and the deep black that swallowed all light. The fortress city's spires jutted defiantly through the tempest, their hard angles etched with the scars of centuries of battle. But even stone and steel could not hold against the invisible tides that swept the gate's outer worlds now. Astropaths stationed in the great spires of Casa Parthex whispered in broken voices, their minds strained beyond mortal limits as they reached across the immaterium for guidance, for hope, for salvation. Their lament was always the same. Chains, breaking, the Emperor's light, drowning in black seas. Words that twisted like poison in the ears of those who heard them. Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughan moved through the shadowed halls beneath the city, his boots echoing on stone worn smooth by the passage of countless feet. In this labyrinth of command centers and war shrines, the weight of the coming storm pressed heavier with every step. He paused before a holoscreen displaying the warp storm patterns swirling just beyond the planetary shield. The images flickered erratically, as if the warp itself resisted observation. A sudden sharp report echoed through the chamber, a failed Vox transmission from an outlying sensor array. Vaughan's brow furrowed. Communication blackouts were growing more frequent, a warning or a precursor to something worse. In the strategium, Captain Thalin awaited, her face pale beneath the fatigue of sleepless nights. The astropaths are near breaking, she said quietly. Their minds are fraying, and the warp storms are feeding on their fear. Vaughan nodded grimly. What of the troops? Discipline is holding, but the men see the skies and hear the whispers. Some speak of doom, others of betrayal. The word spreads that the Imperium may no longer care. The sharp scent of incense filled the room as Commissar Dara entered, her presence as austere as ever. Betrayal is the enemy within, she declared, eyes burning. The warp is a tool of lies. We must not let it poison our souls. Vaughn glanced between the two, knowing the fragile balance they maintained between hope and despair. The old wounds between them, his measured caution, her fervent zeal, were threads holding a tapestry fraying at the edges. The door hissed open, and a messenger entered with urgency. "My lord, there is a transmission from your son." Vaughn's heart clenched. The inquisitorial agent rarely reached out, and when he did, it was never with comfort. The data slate projected a grainy image of a man, gaunt and sharp-eyed, cloaked in the Inquisition's shadowed authority. His voice was cold, edged with a warning. "Father, trust no envoy. The Council harbours secrets. The Empire does not speak with one voice. Your enemies wear many faces." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving a silence heavier than any words. Vaughn closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the message settling deep. His son had stepped beyond the path of a soldier into a darker realm, one where loyalty was measured in shadows and half-truths. Outside, the skies rumbled as the warp storms intensified. Somewhere beyond the fortress walls, the outer defences buckled under invisible pressure, and in the distance, the first screams of the night began. The night was no longer silent. The cold void of space around Casa Mirak was alive with silent shadows. Void stations drifted like ghostly sentinels, their hulls scarred by the ceaseless bombardment from the eye of terror's tides. Here, in the silent black, the tides of war twisted not just the bodies of men, but the fragile bonds of loyalty and trust. Captain Thaleen stood on the bridge of the Vigilant Dawn, a grim battleship tasked with escorting vital supply convoys to the beleaguered fortress worlds. Her gaze was fixed on the flickering Vox feeds, the staccato reports of warp storms and enemy raiders growing ever more desperate. Yet what troubled her most was the silence. Promised reinforcements that never came, convoys rerouted or lost without explanation. "Another supply runner lost," the comm officer reported, voice tight with exhaustion. "Official cause, mechanical failure." Thaleen's jaw clenched. Mechanical failure in the middle of the war zone, or sabotage. Behind her, the ship's voxcaster crackled to life, an intercepted transmission, garbled but clear enough in meaning. "Cadia, sold, Dark Pact." The voice was broken, frantic, cut off mid-phrase. She spun to the communication officer. "Trace that signal. Find its source." The officer's fingers flew across the console, but the trace was lost in the warp's interference. Thaleen's mind raced. The whispered rumors had grown too loud to ignore. A betrayal from within, not just of territory or fleets, but of trust itself. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden emergency alert. Below deck, an explosion shook the ship. Alarms blared as smoke hissed through the corridors. "Sabotage," Thaleen said grimly. "Seal all bulkheads. Lockdown initiated." As engineering teams scrambled to isolate the damage, Thaleen's voxcaster clicked. The voice was familiar. A trusted officer from the Casa Mirak barracks. "Captain, an assassination attempt. Officer Ranis was struck down in the barracks. The assailant fled into the lower levels." Thaleen's heart thundered. Someone wanted the defense leadership fractured, weakened from within. She sent orders to secure the ship and dispatched a squad to pursue the attacker. Meanwhile, she made for the Vox chamber to contact Lord Castellan Vaughan. The reply came quickly, edged with weary authority. Maintain order. Root out the traitors. We cannot afford fractures while the enemy presses at our gates. But as Thaleen prepared to relay her plan, another transmission came through, encrypted from an unknown source. The message was clear and chilling. Cadia falls not by the enemy's hand, but by the knife in the dark. The weight of the words pressed down like a black shroud. The war was no longer just the chaos of battle. It was a war of shadows, of whispered betrayals, and of faith broken in silence. As the vigilant dawn shuddered under the strain of battle and sabotage, Thaleen vowed that no traitor would escape justice, even if it meant standing alone against the very empire she once served without question. The council chamber of Casa Mirik was heavy with silence, thick, suffocating, as if the very stones had absorbed the fear and suspicion that now haunted its halls. Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughan sat at the head of the obsidian table, his eyes shadowed by the weight of impossible decisions. Around him, his captains and advisers exchanged guarded glances, the unspoken question hanging between them. Who could be trusted? The recent acts of sabotage and betrayal had fractured the command, turning allies into suspects and camaraderie into cold calculation. Each member of the Silent Council bore scars, some visible, others etched deep into their souls. None spoke first, each waiting for the other to break the silence that had become a second skin. Finally, Commissar Dera's voice cut through the stillness, sharp as a drawn blade. Our enemies do not merely batter our walls with guns and fire. They corrode us from within. We must root out the rot before it spreads. Vaughan's gaze remained steady. But rash purges will destroy what little unity we have left. We cannot fracture our defense with paranoia. Captain Thaleen leaned forward, her eyes burning with a mix of fatigue and resolve. The traitors move in shadows, but shadows reveal shapes if you watch long enough. We must strike carefully, but strike we must. A murmur of agreement, tempered by fear. Vaughan's hand rested on a datapad displaying the latest intelligence, intercepted communications, strange disappearances among the ranks, unexplained failures in supply chains. The evidence pointed to a conspiracy that ran deeper than mere opportunism. It was a betrayal born of ambition and desperation. Are we not, Vaughan asked quietly, fighting for the Imperium, even as the Imperium turns its gaze away? The question lingered like a dying echo. No one answered. Dera's gaze softened, briefly showing the burden beneath her stern exterior. Loyalty is tested in fire. We either burn together or we consume each other. Vaughan rose, breaking the spell. Then we must decide, what are we willing to sacrifice to save Cadia? Trust, blood, our very souls. Outside, the distant rumble of warp storms grew louder, a relentless drumbeat heralding the coming storm. Within the Silent Council, the real battle had only just begun. The night sky above the Cadian Gate was torn asunder, not by the slow creep of warp storms, or the silent shadows of betrayal, but by fire and fury. The first breach had come. From the high battlements of Casa Mirak, Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughan watched the hellish spectacle unfold. Beyond the void shields, the eye of terror itself seemed to rage, its roiling tendrils spilling forth like spectral serpents into the material universe. Against the backdrop of cold stars, the skies were alive with streaks of tracer fire, explosions blossoming like poisonous flowers in the void. This was no mere raid or probing strike. It was an invasion, an eruption of ancient malice and chaotic wrath unleashed upon the fortress world that stood as the Imperium's bulwark. Yet amidst the external chaos, Vaughn's eyes were drawn not to the enemy fleets, but to the flickering Vox relay beside him, a garbled transmission from Casa Parthex. The message was brief and chilling. Shields failing. Inner defences compromised. Traitor among us. The word struck like a blow to the chest. The enemy was not only at their gates, it was already within. Captain Thaline joined Vaughan swiftly, her face pale but resolute. The breach is worse than expected. Warp spawn and cultists swarm the lower bastions. Our men are fighting desperately, but... Her voice faltered. Vaughan nodded grimly. Then we make a choice. Stand and bleed, or fall and burn. The sounds of battle echoed up from below. The clash of bolter and blade, the screams of dying men, the unholy cries of warp-twisted horrors. The very stones beneath their feet seemed to tremble with the fury unleashed. Amidst the turmoil, Commissar Dera moved through the ranks like a spectre of judgment, rallying faltering squads with words of iron and faith. Hold, for the Emperor, for Cadia. Her voice cut through the chaos, a beacon amid the storm. But as the battle raged, fractures deepened. Whispers spread that some commanders had vanished, that orders were delayed or countermanded, that weapons depowered at critical moments. The seeds of betrayal bore bitter fruit in the blood-soaked streets. Vaughan's mind was torn between duty and dread. Each decision could mean salvation or ruin. His son's warning echoed in his thoughts. Your enemies wear many faces. As the first bastion fell, Vaughan raised his voice above the din. Rally the reserves, seal the inner gates, no step back. The fight was far from over, but in this moment, beneath shattered skies and burning stars, the true war had begun, not just for Cadia's survival, but for its soul. The war room in Casa Mirac was thick with the scent of burning promethium and ancient stone. Hollow projectors cast flickering blue light on maps, scarred by months of attrition, while the low hum of failing power fields underscored the gravity in the air. Amidst this grim atmosphere, the arrival of Inquisitor Calis was like a shadow cast over an already darkened realm. Calis stood tall, his black robe stitched with the silver of the Ordo Malleus, eyes cold and unyielding. His presence was not merely that of an agent of the Imperium, but a living verdict. His every word weighed like chains around the necks of those who dared question his authority. Lord Castellan, Calis intoned, voice resonant and chilling. The war demands sacrifices, yet sacrifices are not enough. The rot within must be purged. Vaughan, weary but resolute, met Calis's gaze. We are besieged by horrors without, and now whispers within. Tell me, Inquisitor, what proof do you offer that the betrayal is more than rumour and fear? Calis's lips curled in a grim smile. Proof comes in blood spilled in secret, in the missing, in the unexplained transmissions intercepted beyond your defences. There are those who would see Cadia fall, not by the enemy's hand, but through the subversion of her own. Commissar Dera stepped forward, voice ironclad. Then let the traitors be brought to justice. The Emperor's light will not be dimmed by shadows. Calis's gaze sharpened. Justice is not always swift, nor is it always merciful. I require access to all command records, all communications, and full authority to interrogate and execute where necessary. A murmur rose from the assembled officers. Thaline's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering like a flame. And if this justice demands we betray our own men before the enemy has even breached the gate? Calis's gaze was unflinching. The Inquisition answers to the Emperor alone. Loyalty to the Imperium demands obedience, even when it is a blade that cuts deepest. Vaughan felt the weight of the moment. The delicate balance between trust and suspicion, unity and division, was about to shatter. He spoke slowly, measured. "Inquisitor Calis, you shall have your access, but know this. Cadia's defense depends on unity. If your methods fracture that, you will find no allies here." Calis inclined his head slightly, a silent acknowledgement. "So be it." As the Inquisitor turned, the holomaps flickered and shifted, showing new breaches in the outer defences. The storm was no longer distant. It was here, and with it, the inexorable descent into darkness and betrayal. The ice fields of Xandros IV stretched like a frozen sea beneath a bitter gunmetal sky, an endless expanse of frost and silence that bore witness to 1,000 battles now swallowed by the cold. It was here, far from the towering bastions of Casamirac, that the Emperor's forces sought to stem the enemy's advance, guarding the vulnerable supply lines that fed the war effort at the Cadian Gate. Captain Thalin's strike force trudged through the biting wind, their armour etched with frost and their breaths visible in the frigid air. Each step was measured, every movement deliberate. The frozen wastes were merciless, and enemy scouts were never far behind, stalking through the shadows cast by jagged ice spires. The mission was simple: secure the outpost at Glacius Redoubt, a vital relay station and a beacon of hope amid the desolation. But simple was a luxury none could afford. As the force approached the outpost, a sudden explosion shattered the eerie quiet, fire blossoming against the icy backdrop in a deadly contrast. The enemy had struck first, their dark forces breaching the perimeter with brutal efficiency. "Ambush!" Thaline shouted, rallying her troops as bolters roared into the frozen night. The air was torn with the crackle of plasma and the sharp report of laser guns, the ground shaking beneath the thunder of footsteps, both friend and foe locked in desperate struggle. Yet even as her men fought, Thaline's mind raced. The patterns of attack were too precise, the timing too calculated. This was no random strike. It bore the hallmark of inside knowledge. Mid-battle, her Voxcaster crackled to life with a terse message from Casamirac. Supply convoy delayed indefinitely. Reinforcements diverted. Trust no one. The words sank like ice into her heart. The betrayal stretched even here, far from the gate. As the fight dragged on, Thaline found herself pushed back toward the outpost's inner sanctum. There she encountered a wounded sergeant, his armour slashed, eyes wild with fear and anger. "They're among us," he gasped. "Saboteurs in the ranks. The traitors have made their move." Thaline's grip tightened on her power sword. "Then we end this here." For Cadia, amidst the blaze of fire and ice, loyalty and treachery collided in a brutal crucible. The frozen waste bore silent witness to the cost of war, where every victory was stained with suspicion, and every loss carved deeper the fractures within. The long corridors of Casamirac whispered with secrets, shadows slithering beneath flickering lights, the silence broken only by the distant echo of footsteps and the low hum of failing power grids. In this web of stone and steel, trust had become a fragile thing, easily shattered by a single whispered word or a glance too sharp to be innocent. Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughan moved slowly through the command sector, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. The recent assaults had left Cadia bleeding, but the wounds inflicted from within were far more insidious. Saboteurs, traitors, and whisperers lurked in the halls, striking unseen, leaving ruin in their wake. A sudden muffled cry pierced the stillness. Vaughan's hand went instinctively to the bolt pistol at his hip as he quickened his pace. rounding a corner to find Captain Thaleen kneeling beside a fallen officer, a trusted aide whose throat had been slit in the dark. The cold sheen of blood stained the cold ceramite floor. Thaleen's eyes met Vaughn's, a mixture of anger and grim resignation. The knife comes not from the enemy beyond the gate, but from within. We are hunted. Vaughn crouched, eyes narrowing at the silent witness to betrayal. This was meant to send a message. Or to silence a voice, Thaleen replied. One who knew too much. As they rose, footsteps approached. Commissar Dera, her expression a mask of stern resolve. The Inquisitor's purge begins in earnest. Those loyal to Cadia will stand firm. The rest will fall. Vaughn looked between them, the cold calculus of leadership settling in. Every ally was a potential traitor. Every decision could spell salvation or doom. The shadows deepened as the council convened once more, each member carrying the burden of suspicion. Interrogations began, harsh, unyielding. Accusations flew like shrapnel, friendships shattered under the strain. Yet amidst the chaos, a deeper threat stirred. Reports came of a secret faction, a cabal within the fortress itself, working to open the gate from the inside. The nightmare that Vaughn had feared was becoming reality. In the dead of night, he found himself alone on the ramparts, gazing out at the swirling darkness beyond the gate. The stars were dim, swallowed by the ever-present shadow of the Eye of Terror. His son's warning echoed anew. Your enemies wear many faces. Vaughn clenched his fists. The war was no longer simply one of guns and strategy. It was a battle for the very soul of Cadia, and he was caught in the knife's cruel edge. The battered bastions of Casa Mirak stood resolute against the encroaching darkness, their walls scarred and weary, yet unyielding. Beneath the shattered banners of the once proud Cadian regiments, the last defenders gathered, a fractured force bound by duty, desperation, and fading hope. Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughan moved among them, his armour scratched and dented, his eyes reflecting the cold fire of resolve. The years of war had etched deep lines into his face, but his voice remained steady as he addressed the dwindling ranks. This is the final wall, Vaughan declared, his tone grave but unwavering. Beyond these gates lies oblivion, but we stand here to deny it passage. Our names will be lost to the stars, but our sacrifice will echo through eternity. Around him, the soldiers tightened grips on bolters and blades, faces pale yet burning with fierce loyalty. Among them, Captain Thaleen prepared her squads, her eyes scanning the horizon for the inevitable storm. The warp storm surged with renewed fury, lightning dancing in impossible colours, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. From the void beyond, the alien vessels of the Chaos fleets gathered, a swirling maelstrom of dark steel and corrupted energy, poised to rend the gate asunder. Yet the greatest threat lay not in the enemy at the walls, but in the fractured loyalties within. Rumours spread of secret deals, of commanders swayed or silenced. The Inquisition's grip tightened, and paranoia festered like a wound that would not heal. Vaughan stood beside Commissar Dera as they watched the final preparations, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. "Do you think we can hold?" Dara asked quietly. Vaughan's gaze hardened. "We must. Not for victory, but for time. Time enough for the Emperor's light to find another day." As the first enemy vessels pierced the void shield and warp-tainted beasts clawed at the gates, the defenders braced for the onslaught. The clash was thunderous, steel against steel, faith against corruption, hope against despair. In the midst of the chaos, Vaughan's thoughts turned to his son, to the warnings unheeded and the betrayals uncovered. The cost of command was clear: to bear the weight of countless souls, and to stand, even when all seemed lost. As the last wall held, battered but unbroken, the stars above flickered once more, a fragile light in the unending night. The war horns of Casamarak sounded a dirge, their mournful tolling weaving through the smoke-choked air like the cries of lost souls. The battlefield, once a tapestry of order and discipline, had become a maelstrom of fire, blood, and chaos. The walls, scarred, cracked, yet defiant, bore the desperate weight of Cadia's last stand. Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughan stood at the ramparts, eyes fixed on the swirling tempest beyond the shattered gates. The eye of terror's warped light bled into the void, casting sickly shadows upon the broken field. And from that darkness, a voice, cold, commanding, and laden with malice, echoed through the Vox. "Cadia will fall," the voice intoned, dripping with inevitability. "Your sacrifices are but whispers lost in the void. The War Master commands your end." Vaughan's grip tightened on his power sword, the weight of destiny pressing down like a crushing tide. The War Master, Horus, the traitor, the architect of galactic ruin, spoke not just through word, but through the dread that had seeped into every heart. Beside him, Captain Thalin's eyes burned with defiance. "We are no whispers. We are the hammer that shatters your lies." But even as she spoke, the cracks within their ranks deepened. The Inquisition's purge had sown distrust, and the once united defenders now glanced with suspicion toward their own. Vaughan's thoughts flickered to his son, an inquisitor walking the razor's edge between loyalty and betrayal. The shadows of war were not merely without, they festered within. The enemy's assault intensified, a symphony of destruction as chaos forces tore at the gates, warp spawn howling in unholy chorus. Bolters roared, power swords clashed, and the very earth trembled beneath the fury. Yet, amid the carnage, the Vox crackled again. The War Master's voice, closer now, almost triumphant. "Your empire is ashes, your heroes dust. Yield, and be spared the agony of oblivion." Vaughan lifted his blade skyward, his voice a rallying cry that cut through despair. "For the Emperor, for Cadia, we stand eternal, even as stars die." The battle raged on, a crucible where fate would be forged in sacrifice and blood. The voice of the War Master was a shadow to be challenged, a doom to be defied. The fortress city of Casa, Parthex, once a bastion of unyielding strength, now lay on the precipice of ruin. Its walls, battered and smouldering, bore the scars of relentless assault, the relentless hammering of chaos legions and warp spawn tearing at the very heart of Cadia's defense. Lord Castellan Vaughan stood amidst the command ruins, the acrid scent of burning promethium and ozone filling the air. Around him, the shattered remnants of his forces regrouped, their faces etched with exhaustion, fear, and grim determination. The city's once bright Vox signals flickered weakly, the warp storms gnawing at the communications as if to silence the defenders' desperate cries. The breach in Casa Parthex was not merely physical, but symbolic. A fracture in the fortress that held back the darkness. The enemy poured through, spilling into the streets like a tide of corruption and death. Every step forward was paid in blood, every inch of ground wrested from ruin. Captain Thalin moved through the chaos, her armor battered but her spirit unbroken. She rallied the scattered squads, her voice a beacon amidst the howl of battle. "Hold the line, for Cadia, for the Emperor." But even as her words rang out, whispers of betrayal shadowed the fight. Certain commanders had vanished, their posts abandoned, their soldiers left leaderless. The enemy's advantage was not only brute force but treachery from within. Vaughn's mind raced with grim calculations. The cost of survival was mounting, and the choices before him grew darker with each passing hour. He knew the Inquisition's grip tightened behind him, rooting out traitors, but also sowing deeper mistrust. In the command chamber, a distorted Vox transmission crackled, a final message from an unseen ally. Cassaparthex falls. The gate weakens. The sacrifice is at hand. Vaughn's gaze hardened. The breaking of Cassaparthex was not the end, but the prelude to a reckoning. The last wall awaited, and with it, the fate of Cadia itself. The burning embers of Cassaparthex cast a crimson glow over the battered walls, painting the night with the scars of war and sacrifice. Smoke curled upward, twisting into the starless sky like mournful spectres, bearing silent witness to the Empire's twilight. Within the shattered command chamber, Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughan stood alone, the weight of countless lives pressing upon his shoulders like a crushing tide. Around him, the echoes of battle still thundered, a grim symphony of bolter fire, screams, and the relentless advance of the enemy. His eyes, tired but unyielding, scanned the holomaps flickering with the last strategic options. Every path bore ruin. Every choice demanded sacrifice. Cassaparthex was lost, and the enemy's shadow stretched toward the final bastion. The Inquisitor's counsel haunted him, reminders that loyalty was a blade with two edges, that betrayal lurked where trust once dwelled. His son's cryptic warnings whispered through his mind like a ghost. Your enemies wear many faces. Vaughn's hand rested on the hilt of his power sword, the ancient weapon forged in the Emperor's own forge, now heavy with the fate of worlds. He faced a choice that would define the end of an era: sacrifice the last reserves to hold the final gate, or withdraw and preserve a flicker of hope for the future. Around him, the last defenders prepared for the storm, their faces etched with resolve and despair. Captain Thaline's voice rang out, steady and fierce, rallying the troops. For Cadia, for the Emperor, stand fast. But Vaughan knew that no cry could banish the shadows gathering within, the fractures that no battle could heal. The war was not just for land or survival. It was a crucible of faith, loyalty, and the enduring question: what is worth fighting for when all else is lost? As the enemy forces massed beyond the ramparts, Vaughan made his decision. The sacrifice would be total. The last wall would hold, but at a cost that would echo through the ages. He raised his blade, voice steady despite the storm within. This is our last stand. Let the galaxy remember the defenders of Cadia, not as victims, but as legends. Outside, the first salvos of the final battle lit the skies, fire against ice, hope against despair, a clash that would decide the fate of all. The once proud bastion of Cadia was silent now, save for the distant echoes of fires smouldering beneath shattered stone and the cold whisper of the void winds sweeping through empty streets. The great fortress world, heart of the Cadian Gate, had fallen, not in glory, but in the grim shadow of inevitability. Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughan stood upon the shattered ramparts, his armour scorched and battered, the weight of millennia pressing upon his weary soul. Around him, the ashes of countless battles lay strewn like forgotten memories, and the silence pressed in, heavier than any enemy's siege. The war was over. The defenders had fought until their last breath, their sacrifice carved into the very fabric of the galaxy's fate. Yet victory was a bitter thing, bought with betrayal, loss, and the death of hope. Vaughan's gaze turned upward, where the dying light of distant stars struggled to pierce the gloom. He thought of the countless generations who had stood where he stood, guardians against the encroaching dark, and of those who would come after, if there was to be any after. Immortality was a curse, he pondered, the endless cycle of watching empires rise and crumble, of seeing friends fall and foes multiply. The price of eternal life was the slow erosion of meaning, a ceaseless loneliness beneath the stars. His thoughts drifted to his son, the Inquisitor, whose shadowed path had once seemed a beacon, but now was a haunting riddle. Loyalty and betrayal were threads tangled in the same weave, and the line between them had blurred beyond recognition. The fortress bells tolled once more, a somber knell for the fallen, a requiem for an era. In the distance, the warp storms churned, a reminder that the darkness was never truly gone, only waiting. Vaughn sheathed his blade, the ancient weight a reminder of the burdens borne and the sacrifices made. As the first rays of a dying sun crept over the horizon, he whispered a final prayer. For those who stood and those who fell, for the light that flickers in the void. We are but shadows, but even shadows can shape the dawn. And with that, the silence settled, deep, eternal, and absolute.